Imagine living surrounded by snow for months on end. The gray sky refuses to open up. The days last only a few hours, and the wind cuts like invisible blades. The cold isn't just a discomfort, it's a constant threat. It watches you silently, waiting for the moment you slip. There are no heaters, no electricity, no thermal clothing. None of the things we now consider essential for surviving the winter. And yet, for centuries, a people endured, and more than that, they thrived in these harsh conditions. They didn't just face the cold, they mastered it. We're talking about the Vikings, feared warriors, bold seafarers, but above all, men and women shaped by the most unforgiving climate in Europe. While many peoples retreated from the ice, the Norse learned to live with it. Snow was their ground, the wind their companion, and the cold their greatest challenge. But how did they do it? How did entire people endure brutal winters for years on end without modern technology? How did they feed their children when the rivers froze? How did they sleep without freezing to death? How did they fight, fish, hunt, and prevail? Today, we'll journey into the heart of ancient Scandinavia. We'll explore the habits, techniques, beliefs, and clever tools that allowed the Vikings not only to survive, but to build one of the most resilient cultures in human history. Get ready to discover the true strength of a people who defied winter and won. And to understand this achievement, we first need to understand their enemy, the Scandinavian winter itself. To understand how the Vikings survived, we must first understand where they lived. Viking Age Scandinavia, between the 8th and 11th centuries, was a land defined by extremes. In summer, the days could last nearly 20 hours, but in winter, the light vanished. In some regions, the sun barely touched the horizon, plunging entire villages into short days and endless nights. The temperatures? They could easily drop to minus 20 degrees Celsius. And in more remote areas, the cold grew even more intense, with cutting winds that sliced through clothing and froze exposed skin within minutes. Snow covered everything, rooftops, paths, crops, and didn't melt for weeks, sometimes months. Lakes and rivers froze, making fishing and transport dangerously unpredictable. It was like living inside a castle of ice, where everything was unstable, uncertain, and often deadly. In this hostile environment, even the simplest tasks became daily battles. Starting a fire, fetching water, keeping animals alive, preventing children from falling ill. Each task required strategy, experience, and physical endurance. There was no room for error. One misstep, one poorly built shelter, or a badly planned meal could mean the death of an entire family. And nature did not forgive. Snowstorms arrived without warning. Northern winds could extinguish fires and smash boats against the rocks. It was a constant war, not against other people, but against the climate itself. Even so, the Vikings stayed, not out of lack of choice, but through adaptation. They learned, generation after generation, to coexist with winter, to treat it not as an enemy to be conquered, but as a force of nature to be understood and respected. And to endure it all, they needed something we now consider basic, clothing. But how do you dress to face a deadly winter without synthetic fabrics, without modern stitching, without zippers or industrial insulation? The answer lies in the ancient techniques we're about to explore. Surviving the cold starts with the skin. The Vikings knew this better than anyone. In a world without synthetic wool or thermal insulation, getting dressed was an act of strategy. Every piece of clothing had to be functional, durable, and capable of protecting the body from constant exposure to wind and snow. And to do that, they came up with surprising solutions using the resources they had at hand. At the core of it all was wool. Produced from the sheep raised in their own villages, wool was woven into thick layers that could retain heat even when wet. Unlike cotton, which loses its insulating power when damp, wool kept on warming, making it ideal in a climate where snow could melt on your body at any moment, only to freeze again shortly after. Over the wool layers came animal hides. Pelts from deer, elk, wolves, and even bears were tanned and sewn using traditional techniques, forming heavy, rugged coats worn mainly during travel, hunting, or long treks. These furs weren't a luxury or a symbol of strength. They were a matter of survival. Long tunics, typically made from linen or thick wool, were layered over fitted wool trousers tied at the shins. On their feet, they wore leather boots treated with animal fat to repel moisture. And on their hands, rough gloves or wrapped cloth. Everything carefully thought out to preserve warmth and block direct contact with ice. Viking women were also masters of textile production. They spun, wove, and stitched nearly all the clothing in their communities. Homemade looms worked constantly during the milder months, preparing garments for the coming winter. And more than that, they understood how each type of wool or hide reacted to cold and moisture, tailoring garments to the needs of each family member. Nothing went to waste. Every scrap of leather, every strand of wool was used. Even animal tendons were turned into sewing thread. To our modern eyes, their clothing might seem primitive, but it was incredibly efficient. And that efficiency didn't stop with clothing. Shelter was just as essential. After all, what good is staying warm if your home can't hold the heat? It's time to step inside a Viking home. Clothes kept the body warm, but it was inside the home that the Vikings truly regained their strength. And for that, they needed more than just walls and a roof. They needed shelter from the wind, heat retention, and a space where they could sleep, eat, and live without freezing. That's why Viking homes were real fortresses against winter. Known as longhouses, these structures were typically built using wood, clay, straw, and turf. But don't be fooled by the simplicity of the materials. Every element was chosen with a purpose to fight the cold. The outer walls, for instance, were often double-layered, with the gap filled with packed earth or straw, creating natural insulation against the freezing wind. The roof, steep and heavy, was covered with living grass or turf, which helped retain heat while also absorbing moisture from the air. Inside, the heart of the home was the fire. A large central hearth, fed with wood or dried turf, kept the space warm. Smoke would rise slowly through a hole in the roof, which doubled as ventilation, allowing heat to build up inside without suffocating the residents. There were no rigid divisions. Men, women, children, and even small animals slept together in the same room. This wasn't just about practicality or limited space. It was survival. Sharing body heat in a closed space helped keep everyone warm, especially on the coldest nights. Beds were simple, wooden platforms topped with thick furs and dry hay. Windows? Rare and tiny, just enough to let in a bit of light without sacrificing insulation. On particularly harsh days, even these small openings were covered with hide or wood. It was a dark, rustic space, and it smelled of smoke. But it was a sanctuary from the fury of winter, a place where warriors rested, elders endured, and children learned from an early age to respect the cold and prepare for it. But surviving winter wasn't only about warmth. It was also about food, preserving supplies, and finding energy when the land slept beneath the snow. So how did they feed themselves when everything was frozen, while the world outside was swallowed by snow? Inside Viking homes, one essential question demanded attention: how to keep eating. Winter wasn't a time for harvesting, planting, or abundant hunting. It was a season of survival, where every meal was the result of meticulous planning during the more generous months. And in that, the Vikings were true masters of preparation. During spring and summer, they hunted, fished, raised animals, and farmed as much as possible. But the secret wasn't just in producing, it was in preserving. Meat was salted or smoked, hung on wooden racks where constant smoke kept it from spoiling. Fish, like herring and cod, were sun-dried or cured with coarse salt, creating a stockpile that could last for months. Root vegetables like turnips and carrots were buried in cool cellars, covered with straw. Grains like barley and oats were stored in ceramic pots or wooden boxes, kept dry and safe from rodents. And drinks? Mead, curdled milk, and even rudimentary beer helped round out their diet, providing calories and energy during cold days. Animal fat was another precious resource. Stored in clay or leather containers, it served as a powerful energy source, and was used for cooking, maintaining internal warmth, and even fueling torches and oil lamps. The Vikings understood that the cold drained the body's energy, and they knew exactly how to keep that inner fire burning. Even on the harshest days, when stepping outside was dangerous, there was always something tucked away. A piece of cured meat, a forgotten root, a hardened but nourishing loaf of bread. Meals were simple, but packed with fat, protein, and carbohydrates, the fuel needed to endure the elements. Mothers taught their children from a young age how to preserve food. Nothing was wasted. Bones became tools, fat became soap, skins became clothing. It was a cycle of total resourcefulness, where waste wasn't just a mistake, it was a threat to survival. But even with stockpiles, there were moments when staying inside wasn't an option. Fishing under ice, hunting through snow, gathering wood, or exploring frozen lands. At those times, the instinct to survive joined forces with another powerful weapon: movement. Because to a Viking, standing still meant freezing. If there's one thing the cold demands, it's movement. The Scandinavian winter showed no mercy. Nature tested every muscle, every joint. To survive, the Vikings had to stay in constant motion. Stopping meant risking defeat in the battle against the ice. In fact, movement was a matter of life and death. In extreme temperatures, the human body loses heat rapidly, and the best way to preserve internal warmth was through constant physical activity. That meant not only hunting and fishing, but also performing daily tasks like chopping wood, building or reinforcing shelters, and tending to animals. Physical activity for the Vikings came in many forms. There was the daily labor, fixing the house, gathering firewood, repairing clothes and equipment. But there was also training. Renowned for their combat prowess, Vikings spent hours training strength, endurance, and agility. They were, in essence, natural athletes, prepared not just for battle against enemies, but also for war against the unforgiving environment. Sports and physical games were common, especially during milder months. Wrestling, races, and strength competitions served not only as entertainment, but as physical conditioning. In winter, training shifted to more practical tasks: lifting heavy stones, carrying firewood over long distances, and of course, combat drills with axes, swords, and shields. This kind of physical exertion didn't just keep their bodies warm and agile, it also strengthened their minds. The Vikings' emotional resilience came largely from their ability to stay motivated and active, even in conditions that could easily break the human spirit. They understood the power of discipline and willpower. By staying active, they were, in truth, arming themselves against winter's fatal grip. Movement also forged and maintained bonds within the community. In a culture where survival depended on cooperation, daily tasks were often shared. Hunting was done in groups, long treks for food or resources were made together. Collective work generated not just physical warmth, but human connection. Without movement, without daily exertion, winter would be a death sentence. But the Vikings, with their innate endurance, knew that warmth didn't come only from fire. It came from the body, which had to remain in motion to stay alive. Now, with bodies warmed and minds fortified, the Vikings were ready for winter's greatest challenge: the fight for survival in the wild. But how did they face the cold when traveling or fighting through frozen lands? Although winter was a challenge inside their homes, the true test for the Vikings happened beyond them, on long journeys of exploration and in blood-soaked battles. Traveling during winter was an act of courage and often pure necessity. The Vikings weren't just farmers or hunters. They were explorers, traders, and warriors, driven by an insatiable thirst for land and riches. Journeys, therefore, were intrinsic to Viking life. Facing the winter at sea or in the unknown lands of other peoples was simply part of the path. Transportation relied on long ships known as drakkars, warships that were both tools of conquest and survival. With narrow, flexible hulls, these ships could slice through icy waters, navigating both narrow rivers and turbulent seas. But the Vikings didn't face only rough waters. Winter brought dangers like sudden storms, frost-covered sails, and ice that could trap the ships. During the coldest months, crossing great distances wasn't just a matter of logistics. It was a constant battle against the elements. At sea, where temperatures could easily drop below -10 degrees Celsius, water would freeze on ropes, sails, and weapons, making every task harder and riskier. To keep the crew warm, the Vikings relied on onboard fires, rudimentary but effective heat sources using glowing embers, keeping life flickering against the howling wind. And once they reached foreign shores, whether to raid or to trade, the challenge continued. Winter battles were brutal. The cold made armor and weapons heavier, more difficult to wield. But paradoxically, winter offered a strategic edge. Enemies were often as unprepared for the harsh climate as they were for Viking aggression. Frozen ground hindered the mobility of their foes, while the Vikings, hardened by survival in extreme conditions, held the advantage. They knew that winning a winter battle wasn't just about brute force. It was about mental endurance. The fight wasn't just against their enemies. It was against the environment itself. To conquer the cold, endure exhaustion, and remain alert. These were skills just as crucial as swordsmanship. Between military campaigns and exploratory voyages, winter wasn't an obstacle. It was an opportunity. The Vikings didn't just endure harsh conditions. They adapted to them, emerging even stronger. They understood that by mastering the frozen lands of the north, they were forging their destiny, creating a legend that would echo through the centuries. And their adaptation didn't end with travel or battle. The Vikings possessed a rare ability to extract every ounce of advantage the environment could offer. When winter tightened its grip and nature seemed to rise against them, the Vikings could still rely on one last vital force: a sharp mind and unshakable belief in their own resilience. But the relentless cold of the Viking winter wasn't just a physical threat. It also touched the spirit. The resistance to adversity was deeply rooted in the Viking worldview, and spirituality played a fundamental role in how they faced their greatest challenges. Viking religion wasn't just about powerful gods and epic battles. It was also about a profound connection with nature and the struggle for survival in a brutal world. The spiritual traditions of the Vikings reflected the belief that humans were never alone in their hardships. The gods and goddesses, represented by figures like Odin, Thor, and Freya, were constant sources of inspiration and strength. At the heart of this spirituality was the idea that life was an ongoing battle against chaos. And winter, with its relentlessness, was a representation of that chaos. But the Vikings believed that in times of great difficulty, they could invoke the gods and seek strength in their legends and myths. For them, facing the winter wasn't just a struggle against nature. It was a cosmic battle for order, survival, and destiny. Odin, the god of wisdom and war, was a central figure for many Vikings. His journey of sacrifice and quest for knowledge, even amidst suffering, was a clear example of resilience. He sacrificed his own eye to drink from the well of wisdom, and in doing so, gained the power to guide his followers through the greatest adversities. The Vikings believed that by following the teachings and examples of their deities, they could find the strength to endure the cold and pain. On long nights, when the wind cut through the air and the snow seemed endless, the stories of Odin and the other gods became a source of spiritual warmth. Above all, these stories reminded the Vikings that every battle they faced, whether against a human enemy or the winter itself, was part of a greater destiny. Courage and resilience were the most valued qualities, for death was seen as part of the natural cycle, rather than fearing it. The Vikings believed they prepared for it with honor. Furthermore, there were more everyday spiritual practices involving rituals and ceremonies to ensure the protection of the gods. Sacrifices, offerings of food, drink, and even animals were made at altars, hoping to draw blessings for the community, the crops, and the warriors. Fire, a sacred element, was also a symbol of spiritual warmth. and many ceremonies were held around large bonfires, where people gathered to share stories, prayers, and songs. These practices not only brought people together, but also strengthened them in the face of the harsh winter. By believing that the gods were on their side, the Vikings found an inner strength that propelled them to keep going, even when conditions seemed unbearable. Winter was more than just a season. It was a test of human determination, a spiritual and physical challenge. And for the Vikings, their spirituality was the key to maintaining sanity and strength. To endure this immense challenge, deep down, they believed that in the end, only those strong enough to face both the cold of the body and the cold of the soul could secure their place in Valhalla, the Hall of Heroes. As the decades passed and the Vikings spread across the frozen lands of Scandinavia, the legacy of their resistance to the cold was not limited to their ability to survive. This resilience laid the foundations of a civilization that, despite being immersed in natural adversity, flourished with remarkable vitality. Winter was a test of endurance and intelligence, and over the centuries, the Vikings forged innovative and practical solutions that shaped their culture, their communities, and even the world we know today. The way the Vikings interacted with nature, adapting to its harshness, still echoes in many aspects of modern society. For example, the construction of shelters was one of the first great innovations the Vikings created to withstand the cold. Their houses, built from wood, stone, and gravel, were designed to retain heat, making the most of the thermal efficiency with the resources available. Thick walls and sloping roofs prevented snow and wind from penetrating, while the warmth of a central hearth spread throughout the space, warming all the occupants. Moreover, the Viking skill in preserving food during winter not only ensured their survival, but also helped create a strong subsistence economy. The trade of cured food, furs, and other natural resources from the cold lands of Scandinavia was a central force in their economic system. Prosperous markets and trade networks, crossing Europe and even reaching Asia, were crucial for the growth and prosperity of Viking communities. But the impact of winter on Viking civilization wasn't limited to daily practices. The cold also served as a catalyst for the creation of a warrior culture, where resistance to pain and discomfort became a core value. A Viking warrior's bravery wasn't just measured by the number of battles won, but by their ability to withstand the cold, fatigue, and adversity without succumbing. And this physical endurance was reflected in their mindset. The Vikings, as individuals and as a society, were forged never to give up. This warrior mentality became one of the Vikings' great legacies. Over time, European societies began to recognize and even adopt Viking combat tactics and strategies, while their ships and navigation methods became models for future civilizations. Resistance to the cold transformed into a metaphor for the struggle for conquest, success, and survival. Furthermore, Viking culture reverberated through the generations, inspiring not only great warriors but also explorers, navigators, and even poets. The epic Viking sagas, with their stories of courage, sacrifice, and overcoming challenges, perpetuated the idea that any challenge, no matter how ruthless, could be faced with willpower, intelligence, and unity. And so, while winter still dominated the northern lands, it also helped forge a legacy that would transcend the centuries. Today, when we think of the Vikings, we are not just remembering wild warriors. We are remembering a civilization built on resilience against the cold, adversity, and the chaos of nature, which, through its determination, earned a prominent place in history. For the Vikings, winter was not just a season. It was a constant metaphor for the fight for survival. And this struggle shaped a civilization that, despite the challenges it faced, never allowed itself to be subdued by the forces that sought to destroy it. They didn't just survive the cold, they thrived in it.